Just a quick note, at the end of this video as an end tag, we will additionally be discussing some real paradoxes from Greek philosophers and so forth, so if you're interested in that, be sure to stick around after the initial wrap-up. But until then, hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where we discuss the lore of the books that I am writing, and as per the title and thumbnail and this, we are going to be talking about a certain sword that appears in some of the aspects of the history of this multiverse, cropping up from time to time. Now, this itself is just a child's toy. It's a little plastic sword, but as with anything, it can still be the inspiration for certain elements that go into stories and whatnot. I mean, strictly speaking, otherwise than just a weapon and other such kind of toys of swords, I have also previously thought of this as like if this was the main body of a ship, like the bridge here and the engine back here and whatever, and then wherever you have the blades, those are some sort of either a weapon or maybe it could be a transport thing, like how the Bifrost shoots out and something, whatever. So, but mainly for the purposes of this, thinking of it as what we would equate to as a sword, as I say. This one in particular, as I say in the books, is called Klaypnih and was created on the planet of Liungbee during the Beta Incursion, which we've talked about before, as being the first proper conflict to take place in this iteration of the multiverse, taking place in the Beta Realm, which is the pocket remnant of the multiverse that came before ours, and was largely fought between the entities and the Vyrol, although neither of them were actually native to the Beta Realm in turn, so those who were there previously, some of them ended up on one side or the other, others were then just bystanders to the whole event going on. Say the inhabitants of Liungbee, so these being creatures that we on Earth might liken to wolves. They have this sort of canine attributes, be the way they created this as a tool by which certain rules of how the reality of this multiverse works could be exploited in a weapons form. I'm not actually going to specify how this sword does what it does, since that is something of a reveal in a future sub-series within the Ragnarök Chronicles. However, beyond that being kept secret, the rest of what we will discuss here are going to be the general aspects of it, as I say, its appearances throughout history. So there will be elements here that will be giving backstory to this, which isn't immediately present when it does show up in the books, or there'll be other elements. So technically they are spoilers, but these ones won't be spoiling anything massive per se. So keep that secret what exactly it does, but it does something which manipulates or makes use of an aspect of reality. In terms of its design, around the handle you have this, well, what would again appear to us to be wolfish engravings and mouldings to match the creatures who made it, and other symbols and letterings inscribed into it as part of acknowledging what it is and its power and purpose. Meanwhile, for the blade, obviously you have a sharp piece of metal because some universal design of weapons, at some point you have a long sharp thing that you can slash with while having a protective handle. So it's sharp on the edges. However, at least part of the way down the blade, maybe like up to here-ish, say, or again the scale's completely off because this is not an actual sword size, or at least not a real, well, it's not a real sword. Up till about here, the actual middle of the blade this way, rather than just being a subtle ridge, it's actually like a cylinder. So if you were to look down the blade here, it's a cylinder, so it's more rounded, so it's a flat bump on this one. Both top and bottoms of the cylinder, like here, just for that detail to all I want to acknowledge. Other than that, yeah, sword. It was made for use by the Ephescus, who were the entities workers. They built everything for them. So at this point in their history, the entities didn't have physical forms. So as such, while they were technically leading the battles and the wars, they had the Aphasicus as their primary source of soldiers. So this is a prototype, or more accurately, just a unique item. There weren't really intentions to make more of them, but it's a unique item that was made to their scale. And so since the Aphasicus are more or less humanoid dimensions, that's why it can be wielded by us as well as sort of as a sword. It's not too big or too small. This is too small because it's a child's toy, but it's only a stand-in for representation for considering it. It's on humanish scale by coincidence, and it's made there and used somewhat effectively as a stratagem during the Beta Incursion. It was hardly the key to winning the war for either side, but it was there all the same. Afterwards, however, it ended up being left on Earth. So there's also in the wake of everything that happened with Kaonat, see the video talking about him previously if you want to find out about that if you haven't seen it already, because while it wasn't his initial intention, as part of how it does make use of an aspect of reality, this sword is essentially a Mansin Slayer. Not to say it's going to kill a Mansin immediately, but the effects of it, if Mansin is struck by it, their abilities are nullified for so long as they are suffering the effects of having been struck by the sword. So when the entities were cleaning up everything that Kaonat had done, say they had the whole Mansin thing reevaluated and set up in a different way henceforth with the Brethren Lords to get rid of the load of Mansins that were there at the time. This was part of what they used, and then henceforth it was kept on Earth for safekeeping so that it could be got quickly just in case things escalated again. From here, it resurfaces around the Middle Ages in Flanders, part of what we nowadays would think of as Belgium. Of course, that country itself didn't exist at that time. And what we have here is two feuding families. I'll note at this stage that when I first came up with this story, I was imagining it being in England. That's not to say that these necessarily are existing British names, but they are more likely to be plausible British names, if still fictitious. Either way, my point is, as I have since, in general, across my writings and storytellings or whatever, tried to now become less Anglo-centric, well, yes, protagonists still from England in these first books, and we are going to keep coming back there because that's where I am. I like to keep trying to incorporate things from other parts of the world as well to acknowledge all equal on this planet. So to moved this thing to Flanders. As part of that, these names probably sound even less accurate for that location, so they may end up being changed come the actual books, the book that covers this aspect of the history, but for now, the original names for these two families, you have Trescorn and Younghood, and the bitterness between these families is such that it's even said that if on any occasion these two were to actually work together towards anything, to have any amiability towards one another, that would only be an omen of terrible things to come. It's like a when hell freezes over situation. They are never going to get along, nor their children, nor their children's children, so forth. The advantage that Trescorn family has over Younghood is that they have come into this possession of a sword. Hence, it became known as the Sword of Trescorn, which is the title of the video, rather than Klaypnih. Anyway, so the Sword of Trescorn, they have this as a weapon, mostly ornamental for show, but it is there as a show of their strength, a symbol of their family might. In something like the sword in the stone situation, where it's not literally stuck in a stone and you're going to only the true Trescorn can pull it out of it or whatever, but you have this weapon displayed, sticking up in a prominent place where it can be seen, acknowledged as belonging to Trescorn, being a sign of theirs, and so if anyone other than a Trescorn was then to extract it and wield it, there would be dire consequences, but if they felt the need to, if they had to stand for their honour, then someone of Trescorn could draw it out and say, fight as necessary, but either way, it would remain stuck there in the centre of the tower, or at least near where the Trescorn family was held up. There was an incident where some creatures passing themselves off as members of the church, so there was a whole complication with that, and as a part of that whole thing, the sword did temporarily go missing, but it came back then swiftly afterwards, and nothing seemed to be different, and, because of that, everything was fine. Of course, it being the Middle Ages, what they couldn't realise was that this weapon had, at that point, been laced with a traceable substance, not necessarily the exact same as how we have radioactive isotopes that we can detect with the half-life and whatever, but along those lines, but perhaps a fictitious alien version of that sort of thing, such that if you had the technology, you could now potentially trace where the sword is. From here, though, again, we jump further ahead in time to 2016, which is then the next time that, chronologically speaking, from our point of view, it comes up again. Those of you who are specifically aware of the books themselves I've been releasing thus far, the fact that they are set in 2016, that may ring a bell. As part of that, you have, during this time, with the Brethren Lords setting up for the completion of their plan for Earth, with them having been guiding humanity's progression towards getting the planet to a point where we can now be used in their stratagem for their part of the multiversal conflict. That's not the Beta Incursion, it's the thing that developed after that. As part of all that, they have, as well as the Mansin, which I haven't technically explained, the Mansins, if you're not already aware, just in case, being these individuals who have had added to their DNA this substance called Ziangg, that we might think crudely of as dark matter or Prima Materia, that's from the baseline of reality, and it helps them, as individuals, manipulate reality around them. So they're extra enhanced so that they can do specific purposes, infiltrating other parts of humanity. But as well as the Mansins, you also have regular human agents. For these human agents, again, because the Mansin is working for the Brethren Lords in theory, they shouldn't usually have any reason to worry about them. However, with the plots of these books themselves, the fact that Philip Quint, the latest Mansin, maybe it's not as certain that he's actually going to do his destined job, because he is depending on the moment, he's sometimes undermining the preparations for the big plan in cases. Because of that, as a precautionary measure, some of those human agents have now been researching into Middle Ages Flanders to try to trace what happened by the historical records to this sword, for they know what its true nature is. And by this point, saying 2016, they have indeed succeeded in that. And so you end up with this sword now present in the White House, just in case it needed to be used against the Mansins. Not that it's definitely going to be used in that case, but you have the politicians who are secretly working for the Brethren Lords. They have access to it there in America. While I won't obviously discuss in any specific details the events of the final book of this set of 4, which is coming out next month, I would say at the end of that, well, after the end of that, the politicians in question don't remain with the sword in their possession. Instead, what we end up with are the distant descendants of the family of Trescorn finding out that they have come into possession of this, or they found out that the sword exists itself. In general, then, non-specifically, but in Book 4 you have an aspect where a lot of facts and secrets, potential, just information from around the world in general, is simultaneously disclosed and potentially found out about, available to be learnt by certain people. And as part of that, say, the descendants of Trescorn find out about the artefact as being an heirloom of theirs, essentially, and the fact that it's currently being held at the White House. So in late summer of 2016, because they are, by this point, or a certain member of the family at least, is rather powerful and influential, able to break into that building and steal the sword before they can be stopped, thus bringing it back into its rightful ownership, again from a human-centric standpoint. and thus it remained as back in its rightful owners for 4 years, until we, however, got to around kind of late spring-ish 2020. Again, planned all of this, or the majority of this, out long ago, so these years of 2016 2020 were still in the future and the books were meant to be out by then, but, well, the 2016 ones were anyway, the 2020 would still... What the point is, we have already passed the events of these books, but either way, in the late spring of 2020, you then instead had a different group now claiming the sword from the descendants of Trescorn. It's one of those ancient artefacts with power and significance which keeps passing from hand to hand. Well, I say that, but we'll come to the next bit momentarily. But either way, these people now are working for something called Project Zeno, which we'll go into slightly more detail about momentarily. But either way, they have found out about the sword because of the person who laced it with a traceable substance back in the Middle Ages. That person left these people now instructions of what to look for, so they'll be able to detect it, and again, they've been apprised of what this artefact is, at least in a vague sense, even if they don't know all the details. So now we are supposed to find this thing, they're now going to do it, so just as how the descendants of Trescorn broke into the White House and stole it, so too now does the sword they get broken into and the sword stolen from them. At which point it will remain for over 100 years in their possession, hidden around the Mediterranean, in their secret base of operations around that general region. Not going to give specifics because, again, it's meant to be a secret. But yes, they keep it there, generally in storage, not for use as of yet. They merely know that they're supposed to make sure that it gets kept safe. For what Project Zeno then is, come a given year, say over 100 years into the future after this point, there will need to be a grand exodus of Earth. Not the only one to ever take place, but probably the biggest, wherein a fleet of ships that have been covertly being built are revealed to then have the pockets of humanity brought onto them and flown away from the planet for their best interest. As part of that, the people who are preparing this, keeping as other artefacts as well, but among them the Sword of Trescorn, Klaypnih, they have that on their storage on one of the ships in general, and so as they hence fly out in different directions into space, one of them, as I say, happens to have this on board. And so later, when we have our own stories set upon that ship, this artefact eventually ends up being discovered by our hero of those stories, and thus we end up with it being used for its final times as an actual sword. It should be noted, of course, that even a broken sword can still be used for other purposes, but because it's not going to be counted as a sword from that point hence onwards, I'm going to be stopping this recounting of its history here. Something else henceforth. So that's an overview for following its path, mostly Earth-centric, but I'll say across the multiverse because as it did start in that other dimension to begin with, not specifying its powers, but it has something that also influences Mansins. Why would that be, and how does that go? Well, you'll have to find out. Otherwise, for many people, it will just be another fancy weapon that we can show off. Hopefully you have found that interesting. Let me know if you did. Obviously, have comments and stuff on social medias, as ever, linked below. All that stuff. Of course, if you want to check out other videos on the channel, you have plenty to now go back and check. Of course, subscribe as well, something that I don't actually say usually, to make sure that you catch other updates. And either way, whatever you choose to do with the channel or the books themselves, to plug those again, make sure to keep on telling stories. Okay, so what I just want to discuss now are the Zeno paradoxes, which I'm mentioning, as you may have just noticed from what I said a few minutes ago, Zeno, Project Zeno, just for the fact that they have that name in common. This is not an intentional connection. I'm not saying that Project Zeno or anything to do with that has to do with the real-world philosopher Zeno of Elia. It wasn't meant to be a connection. I didn't know about this philosopher at the time of coming up with this name in the book, so I'm going to keep it there because, again, I like the original ones as much as possible. I don't want to have to change terms if I don't have to. But either way, even because of that, there's actually another connection that we can draw, which I'll just mention once we've said these paradoxes to begin with. There's one in particular I'm actually thinking of, but when researching this, just to double check I was talking about the right thing, it turns out there were 3 paradoxes, all of which are generally related. So for this first one, let's say that we have a runner who is going to run a given length of track. Before they can run the whole length of the track, they will have needed to run half the length of the track. Before they can run half the length of the track, they need to run a quarter. Before they run a quarter, an eighth, a 16th, 32th, and so on, getting infinitely smaller. Each of these being specific thresholds that the runner has to cross before they can complete any of the rest and the whole track in total. The problem is, because with distance as a measurement, you can keep on getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. What you have are infinite increments, getting closer and closer to the starting line. And because you can keep on halving it, that means you have infinite tasks that the runner has to complete. But you can't do infinite tasks. It's impossible because it's a never-ending list. Now, for this we are getting into infinitesimals and, how at a certain point they become so small that they're all going to be accomplished at the same time. This is going to be a common theme as we then briefly critique these paradoxes, but that's the setup to begin with. The fact is, because you can think of this, you could frame this running of a track as a list of infinite hurdles you have to cross. Because you can't do infinite things, it should be impossible to run that course, but of course we do. Next one, sticking with running, let's say that you have a racer going up against a tortoise. Now, to give the tortoise some advantage because it is slower, let's say the tortoise is given a 100-metre lead, and then both of them set off at the same time, and they each run at a constant pace. Not the same pace as each other, but it's always going to be consistent throughout. Now, the runner, the human runner, is going to make that 100 metres that he was behind to begin with. In the time that it takes him to do that 100 metres, the tortoise will have gone forward some amount himself. Let's say it's just something like 2 metres, because of how much slower he is. So we've now made that time up. So now the runner is going to make up that 2-metre head start that the tortoise now has. But in the time it takes the runner to cover that 2 metres, the tortoise again is going to have moved slightly further ahead. So the runner now has to make up that distance, which the tortoise during which has made another lead, and so forth and so forth. The leads are going to keep getting smaller and smaller, but the fact is, in principle, there still keeps on being a lead. The runner is always having to catch up, and in the time it takes him to catch up, the tortoise has moved further. Again, as we get into things like infinitesimals, even long before that, you just have to get into logical practicalities. These are 3-dimensional beings that are, operating on. Despite what we may do in equations for mechanics and maths or science, we're not just dealing with individual particles, these are big things, and again, you're talking about smaller and smaller increments, however you still also have to think about this over a practical period of time and how the extra length that you're having to go to make up for it is becoming negligible again. But still, technically, that way of thinking about it is a way of thinking about it. It's one of those where I suppose technically if you frame it like that way it could be thought weird, but it's a matter of how you're going to be philosophical, or are you going to think of it more like layman's terms. Then mentioning of time there, again, you can imagine the trends, we're going to be on a similar theme, but this time thinking about time, as I say. If you had an arrow, and this was the one that I was mainly going to talk about to begin with, because it's the one I knew, but if you have an arrow shooting at a target, let's say it takes a second to go from the bow to the target, or it travel that distance. Okay, so it travels that distance in a second. So in half a second it will travel this distance. in a quarter of a second, it will travel this distance, eighth, and so forth, so forth. And you keep getting smaller and smaller in increments of time. The arrow is travelling smaller and smaller distances in those increments until eventually you have got to like the smallest possible way of thinking about time, which is impossible because it's a continuous variable. But you got small and small things. In the infinitesimal of time, the arrow is not moving because you've reduced the timescale to so short that it's not going anywhere. Because the shorter the time, the less distance it's travelling in that period. And so let's say, again, because if we are thinking infinitesimal, it's going to be a lot more than this, but let's say there were 1 trillion of these units in that span of the arrow flight. And so you have 1 trillion instances of, if you look at that snapshot, the arrow isn't moving. And yet, if you've got arrow not moving, arrow not moving, arrow not moving, not moving 1 trillion times, where's the movement come from? Because clearly, if we look at it from a continuous viewpoint, the arrow moves. But it's moving by means of innumerable moments of not moving. Of course, if you think about this, you can apply a force of motion on an object even without the object moving. You can hold something. I've still got this, might as well use it. I can push on this. It's trying to make it move. But because I'm holding it in place, it's not wanted to, but still. So if I was to let go, it would suddenly fly away. But for the moment, the point is, you paused that arrow. It is still in the process of moving, but it's how you think about it. So the whole thing there of why I wanted to bring that up, as well as just the connection accidentally of the name Zeno, is also coincidentally that is kind of how the Alpha Realm works in the Ragnarök Chronicles. You have a string of static universes, each just minutely different to the other, in which then by our Borea energy, our souls moving between them, it's happening at such a rate that it appears like fluid motion. Reality, motion, time, in this reality on our plane of existence, according to the books, we are made up of innumerable motionless moments, and yet nevertheless, to us, they somehow appear to be like fluid movement. The whole backstory, at least from my brief reading, so looking this up before talking about it, of these paradoxes seem to be some discussions around that sort of time with philosophers regarding whether or not motion was real, or rather it's an illusion by our perception of reality purely. And because you had these other philosophers already posing these thought experiments or paradoxes in favour of the notion of motion being real, because Zeno was more supportive of the doctrine of someone else whose name I forget, but who was against motion, he came up with these specifically as a counter, as a reactionary to these first philosophers. Say, well, actually, no, we'll think about it this way. Either way, we now have these weird ways of thinking. Well, I suppose if you're going to think about it like that, but we have to keep scale in mind. Always be sure you have a reference point, a framework when considering anything.